Welcome to the Payments NZ Fireside Chat series, bringing together industry voices to explore how payment systems need to evolve beyond speed and efficiency toward trust, resilience, and system-wide coordination.
How do you increase for capacity, in effect, and transaction volume? And then I do agree with what I think is Dave's point on that. If you've got greater velocity and more transaction volume, maybe we need an iteration on the existing technology to support those high speed, high volume, velocity transactions. I think broadly my point is we could do more now with the existing technology. I mean, why can't I? We have the technology. Why can't I know that that's Qantas when I go on? Technology exists to do that. And I think one of the challenges around this is who is incentivized to fix that problem? And it builds on some, I think I said earlier, we were talking about incentives in digital identity, and we spent half a day on it under the Open ID Foundation. We've released a paper on it. And it's very clear that in a system or a market where the benefits are diversely distributed, it's really hard for someone to make that big decision to step in and solve the problem. And I think digital identity really suffers from that.
I again, apply my relentless cheery optimism to the ability of AI to get something done about this, because although the technology does exist, people don't use it. I mean, nobody uses signed emails or whatever. And actually, when people go to websites, you can put up a pop-up which says, this certificate has expired, it doesn't match or whatever. And everybody will just click OK. But bots won't. Bots will check digital signatures. Bots will try and resolve the certificate chain. And I feel we'll all be much better off when we've got bots doing it for us.
I agree that I should have some easily accessible app that checks the certificate of the website I'm on. But I think those things can be introduced today, but who is incentivized to introduce them? I think that's the challenge that we're not thinking about enough at the moment.
And it's often just those that are the ones that are going to lose the most if it goes wrong, but then that's not necessarily the ones that have either got the funding for or desire to actually solve it as well, because they see the greater good coming into play, and that's not my job. So I think that's a really important challenge.
Or the ones who are regulated to solve it. If you think about AML, KYC, CTF, that, banks are regulated to solve that problem when they onboard you. And what we know now is that point in time identity verification isn't enough, to all the points that Dave's made about bots and the increased threat. So we need to think differently about that as well. Is this still Victoria? Is this still Victoria's bot? Has anything changed since the last time that person appeared? And a lot of the regulation, it has been about point in time. And I think helpfully, that is changing at the moment. If you look at FATF Tranche 2, there's a real focus on risk-based onboarding and also introducing intelligent friction into transactions. But I do think it means that the way we think about identity verification and the persistence of that will have to change.
Vic, is one way of attacking that issue of the distribution of costs to do more to match the distribution of costs to the distribution of the liabilities. And I mean that in the sense that, certainly from the bank's point of view, where I am sympathetic to the issues the banks are facing, the vast majority of the fraud losses they're suffering actually originate in social media and call centres and telcos. None of this works to actually deal with any of the frauds. I get a phone call, hello, this is Virgin Money, and it's from an 0800 number. And the first thing the person says is, can you confirm your name and address, whatever? And I'm like, this is obviously a scam, and I hang up. Turns out it was Virgin Money. So I can't, get my credit card working. Like, this stuff goes on 1 billion times a day all over the world because none of this stuff is done properly. You get text messages coming through that, supposedly from British Gas or something. Like, the fact that all this spoofing goes on, all this nonsense going on social media, these fake adverts that people get taken in by, here's Stephen Fry encouraging you to buy some stupid cryptocurrency
and
or something.
The platforms profit from. I think let's be clear about that. The platforms are not incentivized to not have that advert. I think that's one of that's a massive challenge.
Yeah, so it isn't just about the banks and the payment companies. I mean, if we're going to really tackle the problem that you outlined there, it's a much bigger problem to solve because it involves, tough on fraud and tough on the causes of fraud, so to speak. I think that's an area where some industry coordination could be useful. You could look at the examples of what's going on in places like Singapore to see how that might work.
Yeah, and then multi-sector coordination is really key. As you said, Dave, it's not just the payments or the financial sector, it's others as well, including the likes of the insurance sector, who sometimes carry the can when things go wrong. So, a broader perspective is required.
So thinking about system level type conversations, I guess payments is the ultimate network industry. And I'd like to hear your thoughts on why we need to approach modernisation, interoperability, trust, resilience and governance all as system level conversations. And I'd like to hear from Steve first on this one. And I'd like to start with resilience. So why is resilience of the payments system only as strong as its weakest shared dependency?
Certainly the system, it does rely on the interoperability to work effectively. And so any single point of connection that is not resilient then is a weak point and therefore can undermine trust and confidence in the system. So a network such as a payments ecosystem requires trust and confidence for it to operate effectively. So that's why that resilience piece becomes really, really important. What's really interesting in the New Zealand context is with our bilateral nature of our network, our system is made up of a whole lot of individual connections between entities. So as the number of participants grows, those single point of connections grow exponentially as well. So, for example, if we had 20 participants in the system, that's roughly 190 individual connections, all of which must be strong, resilient, and if any one of those is a weak point, then the system will be undermined, trust will be diminished, and confidence in the system will wane pretty quickly.
I mean, when you talk about shared dependencies, Chad, I think, these are pretty extensive, and I think some of them are well known and well understood. I mean, every bank has presumably a fire drill. Here's what happens when the power goes out, that kind of thing. But, if you certainly look at the UK experience, last year we suffered terribly from ransomware. You look at things like Jaguar Land Rover being shut down. That hack was so bad, it impacted our GDP figures. That's an issue of national security. We mentioned the example of the electricity going down in Spain, wildfires in California, earthquakes, tsunamis, plus the fact the shifting geopolitical environment means there are, old certainties which need to be re-examined. So all of those things, because of the way we've built the system up, kind of layer on sedimentary layer of this, all of those become shared dependencies. I can't remember, but I don't know, but I imagine if you did I'm sure this has been done, by the way, but I imagine if you looked at a really, really detailed study of the resilience of the payments network as it stands now in New Zealand, I'd lay a pound to a penny that the biggest vulnerability is actually the electricity network, not as yet cyber terrorists and so on. And that's because everything has to work online and, this is an argument for offline CBDC and blah, blah, blah. So yes, there's a lot of those dependencies. The way the system has been built has not been built, as you pointed out, to move away from those dependencies. We've just kept building on top of them. So, and I think also, when it comes to, I don't know if it's recognised of the fact that because payments is quite a unique utility, in the sense that, I mean, in financial services, they won't thank me for saying this, but if the stock market goes down for a day, life goes on. Fine, we'll trade some stocks tomorrow or whatever. If I can't talk to the insurance company today, I'll talk to them tomorrow. But payments isn't like that. When payments drops, the whole economy is affected. So we have to look at this much kind of wider view of the dependencies. And the way, just to take that trivial example again, not trivial, but to take that obvious example again, we're heavily dependent on the electricity network. So the solution is not to spend an infinite amount of money trying to make the electricity network absolutely, completely bomb-proof and cyber attack-proof, whatever, but to find ways of working without it. Why can't we transact offline using other, it's that kind of, so when you say system thinking, that's what I interpret that to mean.
I think one of the interesting things, I guess, thinking about payments as a system or the systems, applying systems thinking, is the challenge, I guess, of interoperability and innovation and balancing the two, and perhaps where we need to be thinking, or do we need to be thinking, is interoperability more important than sort of blinding speed of innovation? And what does that look like in practice, I guess?
That's a genuinely difficult problem, Chad, because I think one of the issues for the institutions is to try to capture some of that innovation, capture some of the energy that we see in other areas and harness that and put it to good use. So we want the innovation. However, these are regulated financial institutions, which are the backbone of the economy. There's only so much innovation that you want. I mean, it's like if someone comes on, oh, I've got a much better way of doing this. Well, let's give it a try. And then tomorrow there's no payments anywhere. Well, that's, so there are limits on that. So we want to capture some of that innovation, but we want it in an institutional framework where, of course, the interoperability is really important. However, and here's where I think thinking is changing in those places, interoperability might not mean what it used to mean until relatively recently. For example, when I was at Merchant Payment Ecosystem, I saw a fantastic demo, the Berlin Group demo of. So they had an AI which would go out and look at the various open banking APIs without the standards. It would go to the various open banking APIs and it would interact and it would figure out, what the API was and what it was doing. So the fact that, Bank A had a slightly different API to Bank B, even though they were supposed to be the same, didn't matter anymore because an AI figured it all out. And there's an analogy here, I think, with this happened to me the other day. We were at home trying to find something, some stupid thing from the government, and we were trying to figure out, whether to do thing A or thing B, fill in form A or form B. We couldn't for the life of it. And I just out of curiosity put it into Perplexity. Here is this conundrum involving British government bureaucratic procedures. And Perplexity had it in 2 minutes. Here's what you need to do. Here's the form you need to fill out. It's like, there is something changing out there, which means interoperability may not mean quite the same thing. Interoperability may mean essentially accessible to AI. In other words, implementing proper MCP servers and metadata and all this kind of thing. But actually, it might be a lot easier than the world we grew up in, where interoperability was a fundamental block to progress.
Thank you for listening to the Payments NZ Fireside Chat series. More conversations to come as we continue shaping the future of payments. If you want to hear more from us and global thought leaders in payments, check out our upcoming conference, The Point, 25th and 26th November in Auckland, Aotearoa, New Zealand.